you ready, Gabby? Okay. Good morning, Karen.
Morning.
Morning. Good morning, Carolyn.
Yes, very, very quiet, muted bunch. Yeah,
Sunday morning.
I guess.
Yeah, and it's not even sunny out.
It's quite bright in here.
Yeah. We have this thing called electricity. It makes things bright.
How about that?
Yeah, it's amazing.
And we're just getting used to it.
Yeah.
Well, the temperature is not bad. It says 64, so it's not that bad.
Right. So I want to welcome everybody to our second session. We're going to bring you the source sheet that we began working through last week. And I think we just began looking at this text from Pirkei Avot. Very important teaching, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on it today. The sages said every dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. For the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. But if it is not for the sake of heaven, it is not destined to endure. Some disputes have, value, and some of them are just smoke. Okay? So, what is an example of a dispute for the sake of heaven? For the sages, the classic example of such a dispute is the dispute of Hillel and Shammai, the disagreements between the sages of Hillel and Shammai and the schools that they developed. What is an example of a dispute not for the sake of heaven? That is the dispute of Korach and all his congregation. I assume most of you know Korach, the character who rebelled against the leadership of Moses, and he and his followers were ultimately swallowed up into the ground. Okay? So here we have this notion of a dispute that is for a higher purpose, for the sake of heaven. Okay? And we're going to take a look at a video by Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, who highlights some important facets of this source, and he'll give you his own interpretation. All right, so Jennifer, if you will, pull up the video for us from Rabbi Diamond.
I've always been fascinated by the expression machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven, and especially the context in which it appears in the Mishnah in Avot. The Mishnah says, machloket l'shem shamayim sofa lihitkayem, machloket shelo l'shem shamayim ein sofa lihitkayem, which translates as, a dispute for the sake of heaven will endure, a dispute that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. To me, that Mishnah is counterintuitive. I would think that it would be better for a dispute not to endure. So what is the advantage to a dispute that is for the sake of heaven enduring? When you and I have a debate, there are two possibilities. One is your goal is to be right. My goal is also to be right. And we're both fighting with each other because each of us is determined to be right. But there's a second possibility, which is that the dispute is not about you being right or me being right. It's about trying to arrive at the truth. And in a machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven, hopefully, though I think I'm right and you think you're right, we know that neither of us has a monopoly on the truth. And by listening to you, I might get closer to that truth.
Comments or reflections on what you've just seen and heard?
No, if I could say something.
Please, Liz.
Okay. So one of the things I guess I was kind of hearing is that listening to each other's thought process, the opinions, the point of view, can give a better understanding where each of us are coming from and a way of understanding of getting to where maybe the best places, and it could be a compromise or just at least understanding each other's point of view.
Yeah, so understanding the other person's point of view is as important as arriving at the truth, because it's almost an essential step for achieving an understanding of the truth. If you don't know where the other person is coming, how they arrive at their opinion, then your opinion won't be fully informed. Right? So we're good. Yes, Daniel. Daniel, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I completely understand that, and I try to do that every day, but
At least once.
At least once. I sincerely do. I sincerely do believe in a diversity of opinions and respect. Having said that, I feel, I don't know if it's my age or what, or just the world, but increasingly, I don't see the point. I don't feel like what's being said to me is something that we can mutually respect. Some of the things that I hear are so outrageous that I just throw out my hands. And that has gotten actually be, I mean it sincerely, it's come up in the last 24 hours, really bothers me that my tolerance is really, really going downhill.
Well,
maybe that's a psychological problem that I'll bring up later, sorry.
Well, we don't provide psychological services on this website, Daniel, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not convinced that there isn't something to be gained from understanding the other person's point of view, even when that point of view is widely understood to be outrageous. Yeah, Carolyn.
My thought on that is that even yes, that it may be incapable of understanding, it does cause a perspective to happen, that you can put it on a number line, as it were, the two opinions and where they are. And I think without hearing the other opinion, you're kind of lost in space.
I am reminded of a radical right-wing person in Israel's history that said, when someone says they're going to kill you, believe them.
Okay, so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't understand where they're coming from or what beliefs nurtured that, the belief that was okay. Right? I think that having been a rabbi in a congregation for as long as I have, has, given me a certain perspective on this, because, when you're a rabbi, you sort of have to listen to your congregants, regardless of how outrageous they might be at times. No one in this room included in that. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I just add that when I have an intense conversation with somebody where we differ, I think I come away learning a lot more about myself in terms of how I might sound when I'm, it just gives me a better perspective of myself, which I think is also valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. There, and the more open you are to understanding someone else's point of view, the more likely you are to learn about how you got to be where you are. So that's very important. Thank you, Karen.
That, and also the intensity of my feelings, and just the remembering that I'm not always right, or I'm not the only opinion in the room that's valid.
Yeah.
Even if I don't accept theirs.
Yeah. Okay, so let me bring us to the next text, which kind of highlights one of the distinctions that I think Rabbi Diamond was referring to. This is from the 15th century Italian Rabbi Obadiah Bartonora. And he comments on this particular Mishnah that we just saw about, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. And here's what he says about it. Okay. And I heard an explanation of the word sofa. Sofa meaning its end, its purpose and desired outcome. The dispute that is for the sake of heaven. The purpose and aim of that dispute is to arrive at the truth. And this endures. As they said, from a disagreement, the truth will be revealed, as was revealed in the disputes between Hillel and Shammai, that the law is in accordance with the position of the house of Hillel. And a controversy which is not for the sake of heaven, its desired outcome is the attainment of power and the love of victory, and this end will not endure, as we find in the dispute of Korach and his band, whose aim and end goal was the attainment of honor and power. And their end, in other words, what happened to them, was the opposite. And they wound up in the earth. Right? So the Bartonora suggests that the Mishnah, where it says every dispute is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure, refers to the intentions of the people who are disputing. Those who really seek to attain the truth, they will get it. Those who seek to attain power will not. And dispute that is for the sake of heaven enhances the prospects of establishing truth. So that's a good thing for both parties, even when they are both convinced that the other one is wrong. So how might the truth be revealed from a disagreement? Does anyone has anybody had an example of that recently? Anyone had an experience that, in the past that you can relate, where an argument led to an understanding of the truth? Maybe for you, maybe for both parties.
I'm just
Maybe
gonna-
we don't have enough.
I think we all probably, I think we all have, but nothing comes to mind at the moment.
Okay, Lou, that's,
You have two things going on at the same time. I was just going to say that the word truth is a hard word. What is truth? Truth is in the perspective of a person. I mean, there's some truths that say that it's a cloudy day, but or it's raining. But sometimes some truth, when people say, "Well, this is the truth," it's in the perspective of another person, how they perceive things too.
mhm. So I'll give you an example from today's political life. The subject of immigration, all right? People come to that subject with different experiences. This person was an immigrant who's worked to make their way into American life and to become an American citizen. Another person was, criminalized. Someone was taken advantage of by an immigrant. Yet another person has an employee who is an immigrant and who is kind of struggling to become acclimatized to American life. And all of these experiences actually happen. And all of them are a piece of the truth that we try to arrive at on the broader issue, right? Which is, what's the right policy, if there is such a thing, right? What's the right policy that our country should adopt? And that comes about from a multitude of different experiences. Yes, comments, thoughts? Different approaches. All right, let's take a look at the next source. Right. A somewhat different approach from the 13th century teacher, Rabbi Jonah Garandi, also known as Rabbeinu Yonah, also wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot, and here's what he said about this particular teaching. So he quotes the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, and he says, this is to say, about this teaching, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. The meaning is that they will endure in their dispute forever. Today they will argue about one thing and tomorrow about another, and dispute will endure and continue between them all the days of their lives. And not only this, but also length of days and years of life will be added to them. So for Rabbeinu Yonah, right, he imagines two people or two groups of people who come at a subject with radically different perspectives, and because they dispute together, somehow that dispute leads to truth, and it adds to their lives and their perspectives as well. So the pursuit of truth is this ongoing process, and you're constantly going to have a clash of opinions. That's not only necessary, but it's a positive. Right? Just like with the schools of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, two sides are going to be divided by many different questions, and they'll always find something to disagree about. But if they approach questions not from a preconceived position, but as part of the broader search for truth, then that's what God wants. That kind of dispute is a positive dispute. And God wants it so much that God will reward them with long life. And that way they get to continue the argument. They get to continue the dispute. And even though new disputes are constantly going to emerge out of this process, sometimes individual disputes get resolved. Right? So what can we learn from this? Someone has to unmute themselves.
Find somebody to argue with.
Find someone that, not just, what many of us would do would be to find somebody who shares our perspective on most issues, but find someone who has a different perspective. And that will broaden your understanding of the truth.
Okay.
Yes, Ronnie?
I think that some disputes will never be answered. They will continue for millennium. You can argue and argue and discuss, but some truths will not be answered.
Right. Some questions are just elusive. Right? That's why we have a multitude of religions. Right? Different religions take different approaches to different questions, and sometimes within one religion, and I think of Judaism as having a specialty with this, that we thrive because of the multitude of approaches, the multitude of solutions. Right? So having those disputes is not necessarily a bad thing. Rabbeinu Yonah says that's what gives us life. So all to the good. Right? Other comments, thoughts? Yes, Anna.
Well, what do you think about what should our attitude be then? Do we go in with our perspective and not have to hold both perspectives and just trust that in that encounter something else will come out? Or do you think that we need to go in there with a sense of being more like, thinking about the other perspective as well? What's a better approach?
Well, I don't know that those two are mutually exclusive. I think, we all come into certain disputes with certain preconceptions. Some of them may not be so well formed. Sometimes they're very solid. Hmm?
I'm thinking of lawyers. When you're a lawyer, you walk into the courtroom and you don't tell the other side, well, I can see your side of the, you go in there and you go, this is what it is, and you argue it, and you have somebody else decide ultimately the outcome.
Oh, I would think that a really good lawyer in a trial would tell a jury, for instance, I understand the point that my learned opponent is trying to make. And here's why I disagree with it, or here's what I think is the flaw in it.
Mm-hmm.
Andy, it's Daniel, and I'm
Yes.
May I address that?
Please.
I've done a fair amount of medical expert work, and the thing that's been so discouraging to me is the absence of a search for truth among attorneys. In the work that I do, they are not interested in the least in what is the truth. They are only interested in defending a particular point of view.
Yeah. But I would like to think that another approach might be more effective in the end. Brian, you have a comment. Unmute yourself, please.
Sure. I think that what they're getting at is not whether or not um, that the way in which truth of anything is to be understood is through that dialectic of argument, and that some of what was just referred to in terms of what happens in courts, it's not that one side necessarily has the truth. It's the idea of this dialectical approach to argumentation that reveals to people who are not necessarily the direct parties, but those who are observing the argument can draw their conclusions from it. And that that you're never going to decide that one side or the other has the truth, but that you're going to be able to start to reason through this method of argumentation. And that's the way in which even the Talmud is structured to operate.
That's correct. Right. Yes, Carolyn, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say that in the lawyer situation, it is the job of either side to present one truth. I mean, you're defending your client and presenting that point of view. That is what you're charged with doing. I don't know that anyone would say that a lawyer's job in a trial is to present the whole truth, but only their clients.
It's the judge's job to find the truth.
Unfortunately, I mean, that's the way the system is designed.
Yes, but Carolyn, I still believe that a lawyer can do that, but still effectively illustrate an understanding of why, at least superficially, the other side might be attractive.
Oh, I think that also is the most effective way. And also, if you don't know the other side's argument, you're not being an effective lawyer.
Right. Lou, you were going to comment.
I had a teacher once who used to discuss this argument, and he would say, thesis, antithesis, antithesis, come together to create synthesis. So the arguments from one to the other, you learn things, and out of that, you can take elements from each to come to a better understanding.
Yes, that's a time-honored philosophical approach, right?
It may go back to Aristotle, but I never studied Aristotle. I don't know.
It's largely attributed to Hegel. But that's about as far as my philosophical expertise goes. So, I can't tell you more than that. Other comments? All right, then, let's take a look at the next teaching, which is about the model of Hillel and Shammai and their students. And this particular teaching is really startling because it doesn't fit the image that we have of Hillel and Shammai and their students as essentially colleagues, right? But this particular teaching comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. So Rabbi Yoshua Onaya taught, and it doesn't flesh out the situation, but there says there was one dispute. There was a day when they were going to argue over something. And the disciples of the house of Shammai took positions down below and killed disciples of the house of Hillel before they could ascend upstairs. In other words, into the court where the students would debate an issue. It has been taught, six of the disciples of the house of Shammai ascended. They went up to represent their position. And the rest of them took positions against them, the house of Hillel, with swords and spears.
Or should we take that, Rabbi, as metaphorical or literal?
Well, historians suggest that there was a time when it literally happened, that these particular violent events took place in the years right before the destruction of Jerusalem, right before the destruction of the Second Temple. And there are a couple of parallel sources that suggest that this must have happened because the sages declared a fast on a certain day to mark a time when a certain controversy caused many, many students of Torah to be killed. Okay. So, some people apparently had the motive not only of arriving at the truth, but of winning at all cost. Right? So you can say that you're acting for the sake of heaven, but that can still lead you to do terrible things.
Rabbi?
Yes?
Do we know what the subject was, what they were debating that caused such a violent reaction?
We don't know for sure. There is some speculation that it had to do with the defense of Jerusalem. There were those of the house of Hillel who were willing to reach an accommodation with the Romans, and there were those in the house of Shammai who were among the zealots who said, God is on our side and we fight for God at all costs. Now, in the end, who was right? It's not that you shouldn't fight evil at all costs. You have to know when to fight it and how to fight it in different times. Right? Sometimes you even have to make an accommodation because that's the best and safest course to preserve life. And that was the position of Beit Hillel. That was the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was of the house of Hillel, and who, as the story has it, was carried out of Jerusalem by his disciples in a coffin. Okay? He was alive, but they got him out on the pretense that he was dead, and because there was a rule you couldn't do burials in the city of Jerusalem, so they were able to persuade the other guys to let them out. And at a certain point, he got out of the coffin and went to visit the Roman general Vespasian, and reached some kind of an accommodation with him about the future of Jewish life in Palestine. Okay. Other comments or questions here? Okay. This was a case where uncharacteristically Beit Shammai prevailed, but not necessarily because they convinced their adversaries. Right? So that was maybe where the search for truth was corrupted by the need to succeed at all costs.
Oh, Rabbi,
yes, Anna.
But that's often the case. There's often, and this is part of the problem, I think, in any kind of dialectic, is that you often have you often have somebody who will want to assert their truth. And the problem is that they're not entering into this process of the search for truth, and they're not playing by the rules. If the rules are, we're going to enter into a dialectical to try to figure out or present different sides. So what is the other side to do in that situation?
Yeah. That's, you know, to have one side play by the rules and the other one try to trump them with force, yeah, that's not a good sign for that society. There was a time-honored tactic by the ones who sometimes advocated for force. There is a verse from the Psalms. It says, "Et la'asot Hashem heferu Toratecha," which means it is a time to do for God, for they are neglecting your Torah. Right? So they said, well, you know, in exceptional times, when the life of the Torah is at stake, then you have to take drastic measures. Question is, you know, when is that, and when is that right? And who decides that?
Those are good questions.
So that was a tactic that was very popular, not only in that time, but much later as well. When I'll give you a different example of when that happened. There was, you know, in the Maccabean War, at the beginning of the Maccabean War, the Jews were losing. And why were they losing? Because they wouldn't fight on Shabbat. Right? And it didn't take Antiochus and his generals very long to figure out that that was a really good time to attack the Jews. You know what they said? They said, "Et la'asot Hashem." It's a time to do for God. And we're going to have to change our tactics. We're going to have to be willing to fight on Shabbat. Because if we don't, we'll be gone. Okay? So that is certainly much more understandable than the case of those who, you know, simply took charge of Jerusalem and said, no, you're not going to make any accommodation with the Romans. You're going to have to accept that we're in charge. Because et la'asot Hashem. Okay. Other comments or questions here? Yeah, it does seem that there are times in Jewish history, and this text illustrates one of them, that people simply used force to decide which way was right. But if you look back at our teaching in Pirkei Avot, that's a machloket that is not l'shem shamayim. That's not for the sake of heaven. Yeah, Ronnie, you wanted to say something? You have to unmute.
Wait, okay. Jerry has he's not in.
This argument between Hillel and Shammai we talked about.
Well, the schools of Hillel and Shammai.
Okay. So my question is, they talk about the voice from heaven who comes and gives out the right answer. How come we didn't get it this time?
Oh, well, it's not universally accepted that it was, you know, it was okay to rely on heavenly voices. And sometimes you don't get heavenly voices. You don't get direction directly from above. Right? How often has that happened to you, Jerry? You had a problem and, you know, God just came down and told you exactly how to deal with it.
More than you know.
You just couldn't understand the message, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But this argument we're talking about, did that turn out to be what they say on Tisha B'Av about the sinus chinam between the Jews?
The boundless hatred, yes. That is one powerful instance of what they referred to as causeless hatred. In other words, you can disagree with somebody about the law. You can even impose the law, but you're not allowed to hate the other side. Which I think is, going to be the interesting challenge in America after Election Day, regardless of who wins. How are we going to accept each other as Americans, even though we're very divided on the kind of course the country should take? So we're going to have to try very hard to avoid that kind of sinat chinam, that kind of hatred that hates just because somebody's on the other side. Okay? And unfortunately, I think that a lot of that has been fanned in recent years, and we're going to have to find a way to deal with that. Other comments or questions before we go on? Okay, so let's go back to the next text, and this from the Talmud, a different approach about Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. It says, come in here. Even though the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed regarding all these cases of marital law, including rival wives, sisters, an outdated get, bill of divorce, a woman whose marital status is uncertain, one who divorces his wife and later she lodged with him at an inn, betrothal by money or with the equivalent value of money, by a pruta being the lowest coin in the realm, or with the equivalent value of a pruta. In other words, was that a valid betrothal? Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying women from Beit Shammai. This teaches that they practiced affection and camaraderie between them to fulfill that which is stated: love, truth, and peace. Rabbi Shimon says that in certain cases, where, according to one side's opinion, a person's status was definitely problematic, they did refrain, but they did not refrain in the uncertain cases, where, according to one side's opinion, a person's status was only potentially problematic. Now, does anybody know what we're talking about here with problems relating to marriages? Okay, so the big problem is personal status in Jewish law, okay? Because if you have a different understanding about marital law, that can lead to doubt about a person's status. That could even lead to someone being categorized as a mamzer, which is normally translated as bastard, but it doesn't have the same connotation in English. In Jewish law, a mamzer is someone who is the product of either an adulterous relationship or a prohibited relationship, right? It's not a child who's born out of wedlock. In Jewish law, those are called normal, right? Doesn't sound normal to most of us, but in Jewish law, it is. It's just, you're just an ordinary Jew if you were born out of wedlock, right? But if you were the result of an incestuous relationship, prohibited incestuous relationship, or if you were the product of an adulterous union, right, you would be regarded as a mamzer. And the consequence of that is you could never marry within the congregation. You could only marry somebody else who had the same status as you are. Or very likely you would kind of walk away from the community. So obviously, the rabbis did everything possible to avoid categorizing someone as a mamzer. They understood the inherent unfairness of that, but it's a Torah law. So different opinions about marital law could lead to disputes between the two schools about someone's status. Right? So if you have someone who is regarded as a mamzer by Beit Shammai, but not as Beit Hillel, you see the problem? Okay. So the rabbis tried to interpret the law as narrowly as possible so as to minimize the negative impact. So, the goal is truth and peace, right? That love, truth, and peace. That's the verse from the prophet Zechariah that is quoted here. And even when they disagreed, each side respected the other's opinion so as to alert them when there might be a possibility of a problem according to the other side's opinion. Okay? So this is really, a remarkable degree of cooperation between two schools and two different paths of interpretation of Jewish law. Okay? How do you interpret love of peace in this setting? Anyone?
Respect, shalom bayit.
Shalom bayit. Okay. Respect for the other side. Okay. Yes?
A willingness to compromise.
Willingness to compromise, to cooperate with the other side, even though their position is different. And we work with them. Okay? Anything else on this?
You do your thing, I'll do mine, and if we can get together, that's great, and if we can't, that's too bad.
And even beyond that, Daniel, that, you do your thing and I'll do mine, but I will help you and cooperate with you so as to allow you to do your thing. Right? So it's a really high degree of cooperation, which helps lead to love and peace. Right? All right, other comments or questions before we go farther? Okay, let's go to text number 8. Okay. This is from Rashi's comment on a related passage of the Talmud, where it says that they didn't refrain. Okay? It says Beit Hillel did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Shammai. They would notify them which women were children of rival wives, and so they would not marry them. Okay? Where it says rival wives in Yibum relationships. Okay, what is a Yibum relationship. Okay? Yibum relationship is about the rule that existed in the Bible and was carried into the rabbinic period that says if a man dies and leaves behind a widow and no children came from that union, then the brother of the one who died has an obligation to take the widow as his wife. And that the Bible describes that as to carry on the name of the deceased brother. Okay? Well, this had pluses and minuses associated with it. The plus was that the widow was, not abandoned. Right? She was, even though she didn't have children, she was taken in and given an opportunity to have children. The downside, of course, is that the relationship might not be as successful as the one was that brought the brother and his wife together. And so gradually, Yibum has been eliminated from Jewish life. There is a ritual through which the brother is released from the obligation to marry the widow, and that is the normal course of action. Today, you would never see this institution of the brother marrying the widow. You would never see that being carried out. But here, in that time, it did exist. Right? And so Beit Shammai would tell Beit Hillel which women were in certain relationships that would, by the rules of Beit Hillel, make it impossible for them to be married to certain people, and vice versa. Beit Shammai had its own standards, and each one respected the other school's standard, not only as an independent opinion, but also by helping them to live by that opinion. Okay, so this is definitely a case of unity through diversity. That there's trust and communication between both schools. Yes, Ronnie.
Okay, was the reverse also, so if a woman died, which was very common back in those days in childbirth, and there were children, and there was a husband left with children, what would be the responsibility in that case?
He only has the responsibility to raise the child, although in those circumstances, a new marriage in fairly short order was quite common, but he didn't have an obligation to do that.
To marry a sister.
Yeah, he did. And no, he did not have that kind of responsibility at all. Yes, Lou. You need to
had to unmute. Yeah. So it's my understanding that back in pre-Shammai Hillel times, during the first and second temple periods, that this verse from Torah was there so that the brother who died would not be childless and not be able to pass on an inheritance. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
All right. So back in those times where men had multiple wives, if the brother who died had children through other wives, would another brother still be required or obligated to marry the widow who was childless?
I believe not. You know, it's not like I've had a lot of practical experience with these cases since, you know, we haven't been doing Yibum for a while, but my understanding is not.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other comments, questions? Really, you know, the main focus of this, of course, is not on the institution of Yibum itself, but the relationship between two parties who operated with different sets of rules, right? And two parties in the Jewish community who had to maintain a community that lived by different rules. So, yes, Carolyn.
One might go back then to the concept of the course, and that without the discussions and the disagreements and the understanding of each other, then how would one even know, without that communication, what those lines were, what those, who even those individuals were? I mean, that's an essential part to get there.
Right. It's not as if there were legal records of these sorts of things.
Right.
Right? So it purely depended on the knowledge of community leadership. So yes, both schools had to respect each other and respect each other's rules and work together in those situations. Okay. We are going to stop here and I'll have a short break before our mysticism class. And when we come back next week, we'll have a short video which will deal with the teaching that we've just been looking at. So thank you all very much. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.